Hello and good afternoon, or I guess depending on where you are, good morning, good evening, good night. Welcome to the live stream for today. My name is Natalie, and I'm the founder of Aardvark. It's an accessibility testing platform. So if you want to check that out, a21.com, you can go take a look. Free account, doesn't require a credit card to give it a try. So check it out. So today we're going to be talking about ARIA, and we're going to look at correctly using ARIA so that we're not actually causing more accessibility problems. And hopefully we can solve some accessibility problems by using ARIA correctly. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for being here. And I guess before we get started, I should talk about ARIA for a second. And because first thing is, what is ARIA? So ARIA is an acronym that stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And it was created as a way to bridge the gap between what was happening with really Web 2.0, probably between like say 2005 to 2010. People started really focusing on building out really rich internet interfaces that felt like native applications, which previous to that, websites were not typically very capable. And it typically involved a lot of either Flash or, like, as people started to discover in the Web 2.0 era, that you could do a lot of this stuff with JavaScript. And it quickly revealed that there was a gap where there wasn't really a good way to make those things accessible. And so that's where ARIA kind of steps in and helps to try to fill that gap in and helps our custom components that we build in HTML communicate with assistive technology in a better way. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the topic that we have for today. So I have some slides, and then we're going to be doing some live demos. And of course, if you have questions at any point, just post them in the chat and I will see them. Hopefully we had a little bug a couple of streams ago where I actually couldn't see the ones being posted to LinkedIn, but hopefully I'll see them. And if you're watching, we're streaming live simultaneously to YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. So if you're on a certain platform and you start to have some kind of technical issues, you can jump over to one of the other platforms. Just look for Aardvark Accessibility on whatever platform it is, and you'll find the live stream there. All right, so roughly today we're going to cover 4 things. We're going to talk about the rules of ARIA. We're going to talk about the building blocks of ARIA. We're going to look at some live demos, and we're going to talk about some common mistakes that people make with ARIA so that you'll know what they are so you can avoid them. Now, before we get started, I think last week, WebAIM released their 2026 WebAIM Million Report. And what that is it's a report where they survey the top 1 million homepages on the internet. So they get a listing of what the top 1 million sites are, and they look at just the homepages. They run their automated scan on them, and then they put together a report that broadly shows some wide trends. And I think it's a good tracker for general trends in accessibility, but I think sometimes we read a little bit too much into the results because it is pretty limited, right? Like you're just doing an automated scan on 1 million homepages. There's a lot being left out there. So let's talk about this a little bit because you may have seen some of these numbers being shared around. So according to the most recent findings, 79.4% of the top million pages use ARIA. And they found that pages with ARIA on them had on average 34.2% more errors than pages that didn't have ARIA. And you might think that's somehow ARIA's fault. Maybe we should avoid using ARIA. Well, we'll talk about that. There's some nuance there. ARIA isn't necessarily the cause of the errors, but more accessibility errors does correlate with more complexity. So pages that are using ARIA do tend to be more complex with more different types of components and things like that. So it would make sense, regardless of whether ARIA gets used or not, that pages that are just more complex and have more things going on would have more accessibility errors. So there's definitely some of that going on. And then we also saw that 35% of role equals menu implementations introduce some kind of barriers. And we'll talk about role menu because it's widely misunderstood and widely misused. All right, let's dive in and talk about the rules of ARIA. So you may have heard people talking about these. You may see people posting about them. If you do a web search for that phrase, the rules of ARIA, there's a lot of results where people have written up their different takes. The origin of the rules of ARIA is an actual W3 document, like from the official people who created ARIA. That actually lists out 4 rules of ARIA, but it is a deprecated document. So the information in it is still good. It wasn't deprecated for that reason. It was mostly deprecated because that information was absorbed into other documentation. And usually you'll see people post 5 rules of ARIA. I'm going to share 5 today, but just know that original document only had 4. So the 5th one that I go over today is not from the original document. All right, so you've likely heard that the first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA. And that's close. What the first rule actually says is if you can use native HTML, use that instead. Because we're going to get all kinds of accessibility for free, and we don't have to worry about getting all the different little pieces of ARIA right. We don't have to worry about adding extra handlers and things in our JavaScript. So if you can use a native HTML element, use it instead of relying on a custom component where you're going to have to use ARIA. So for example, if you need a button, just use a button tag. Don't use a div with a roll of button. It actually makes a difference. The native element automatically has support for keyboard behavior. It has focus management. It's got accessibility built into it. And you don't have to do anything extra aside from use that tag correctly to make it accessible. When you make a div and you give it a roll of button, you are now on the hook for doing all the work to make that div behave like a button. So you have to actually make sure that it can receive keyboard focus. You have to actually make sure that it reacts not just to a click event of a mouse, but also to a keyboard. And you also have to remember buttons react not just to the enter key, but also the space bar. So you're on the hook to remember all of that and implement all of it manually in JavaScript. Whereas if you just use the button tag, you get all of that for free. Okay, second rule of ARIA is don't change native semantics. So native HTML elements have roles that are implied. For example, a button tag automatically has a role of button. A link has a role of link. A heading has a role of heading. It's pretty straightforward most of the time. You don't want to override those. So, for example, I wouldn't use a button if I wanted a heading because a button already has a role of button. And now when I add role of heading, I'm just making things really confusing. And it's pretty unpredictable how that element is now going to behave when it starts interacting with assistive technology. So we're introducing a lot of uncertainty. So if you have to build a custom component, you want to avoid using elements that actually have roles that are implied, which means that you're mostly going to use divs and spans. So if you have to make something a button and you cannot use a button tag for some reason, the only thing that you would want to use instead is a div or a span because there's no native semantic role that those elements have. So you don't want to have clashing semantic roles with what elements you chose to use and then the roles that you're assigning with ARIA. All right, rule number 3 is you have to ensure keyboard accessibility. So adding your ARIA attributes will help to tell assistive technology what something is, but it doesn't actually make it work. You still have to make it work. So, like I already covered, you're on the hook now to add a bunch of JavaScript event handlers to that element to make sure that it actually functions the way that it's supposed to with assistive technology and with the keyboard. And rule number 4 is you can't hide focusable elements. So we do have some attributes that will help to hide something for accessibility purposes. So if I have something I want to hide from assistive technology, for example, there are ways that I can do that. So I can assign it a role of presentation, which just means, hey, this is just here for looks. It's a little curly Q in my design. It doesn't have any meaning to the design. It's strictly a visual flourish. And I don't need that to be read out to screen reader users. So I could give that a role of presentation, or I could give it an attribute of ARIA hidden equals true, which would then hide it from assistive technology. Now, you can't do that if it's actually a focusable element. So you can't put role presentation or ARIA hidden true on a link or a button, because now my keyboard can still tab me there, but there's nothing. It's just an empty element as far as assistive technology is concerned. So some screen readers are just going to say, okay, well, we tabbed here, but it's nothing. It's just role presentation. And so they don't announce anything. And it's just a very confusing experience because you have things that you can focus on, but then you're saying, these don't do anything. So be careful about that, because I see it a lot, actually. I see a lot of form elements and a lot of links and buttons with ARIA hidden true on them. So be aware of that. And then the 5th one that isn't in the original document, but you'll see listed in a lot of the different blog posts and things that go over the rules of ARIA, is that if it's an interactive element, it must have an accessible name. So if we're making a custom form input, some kind of custom interactive component, we're making buttons, links, inputs, etc., all of those must have accessible names so that users understand what it is and how they should be interacting with it, what information they should be entering, where is that link going to take me when I click on it, what is this button going to do when I click on it, etc. All right. So that's our 5 rules of ARIA. So now we're going to head into the actual building blocks of ARIA so that we understand what those are. And we've got 3 of them. And let's get started with roles. All right. So roles define what an element is. So this is what's going to tell assistive technology, what is this? So it's kind of the job title of the element, for example. And we'll go through the categories of what we have here. So first we have landmarks, and these are the major sections of an HTML page. So we have a header section, we have main content, we have a footer, we may or may not have a sidebar, we have navigation, we have a search, we have form, and other types of regions that we can have in there. So ideally, any of the content that repeats across your site on every page, right at the top of the page, should be in a header landmark. Or anything across the bottom of the page should be in a footer landmark. If you have a repeating sidebar, that should be in a sidebar landmark or a complementary landmark. The landmarks are a little bit funny because the name of the HTML tag doesn't always match the name of the role. So that's well documented online. You can look those up and see what they all are. But any HTML page that's online should ideally have landmarks, and at a bare minimum should have a main landmark to tell me this is the main content area. If somehow you have a page with no header, footer, navigation, etc., like it should at least have a main landmark. Next up, we have widgets. And by this, I just mean any other kind of element, basically. So buttons, tabs, progress bars, sliders, tooltips, etc. any other kind of little interactive element that we might have on the page. So we've got rules for all of those, dialogues, etc. We want to make sure that we're aware of what all of those rules are and that we're using them correctly when we're creating those different types of elements. Some of those things exist in HTML already, right? Progress bar, button, etc. already exist in HTML. And so if we can, we want to use the semantic markup. Other things like tabs, those don't actually exist. So we have to actually just create those with ARIA. And we want to make sure that we understand what the structure of that should be and how those should be set up. And I have a comment from Ariel, sorry if I mispronounced that, to say perhaps we should add a rule to translate or localize your ARIA. Yes, yes, please. That does get missed quite a lot, that people will make an app or a website translatable, but then the ARIA attributes get missed in that. So yes, if we're using labels and things like that, we want to make sure that those are getting translated along with everything else. All right, our next type of rule are the other types of rules that give our content structure and help to describe the relationship between the different bits of content on the page. So for example, headings and lists are the main ones that we would use here, but there are other things as well, tables and articles and separators and things like that. So just to help us describe, if I have a list of 10 ingredients I need for a recipe, those should be marked up as a list so that it's easy to understand the relationship that those 10 things have with one another, that they're a group that goes together. And then we have the live regions, which are going to alert us to any changes that have happened on the page. So, when you get the little banners, toasts, and the other types of things that pop up to tell you that something has happened, a message has been received, something has successfully saved, or some kind of job that was running has completed, any of those kinds of things that would alert a user, we want to make sure that those are a ARIA live region so that users who are using assistive technology also get alerted to them, because otherwise they're very easy to miss. Okay, our second building block is states. And states are dynamic values that change as users interact with the page. So let's go through what some of those states are. So first we have ARIA expanded, which just tells us, is this thing open or closed, right? So if it's a tooltip, a toggle of some kind, a disclosure element, a drop-down menu, any of those things, is it open or is it closed? So just ARIA expanded, true or false, is it open or closed? The next one is ARIA checked. So if we're making some kind of a replacement for radio buttons or checkboxes, we would want to use ARIA checked so that we can indicate whether or not it should actually be in the checked or selected state. And this one is an exception. We have true, false, but we also have mixed. So if you think about those cases where you've got nested checkboxes and one can be selected at the top, and if some are selected underneath it, but some aren't, it has often it's visually shown as like a straight line through it to indicate that it's in this mixed state. So that actually exists in ARIA as well. So this one is true, false, or mixed. Our next one is ARIA selected. So in the case where we have tabs or we're selecting items from a drop-down, we need to indicate which item out of the choices is actually selected. So that's how we would do it here. And it's true or false. Is this item currently selected? Is it the active item right now? Then we have ARIA disabled, true or false, which just answers, is this element interactive right now? Or has it been disabled? And we should be skipping over it and ignoring it. And then we have ARIA hidden, which we already touched on a little bit. True or false? Should assistive technology ignore this or not? So yes or no. So if you are creating a kind of component or custom element that would use any of these states, remember that you have to have JavaScript that's going to update those states as users interact with your page. So just adding ARIA expanded on a drop-down menu doesn't do anything. You have to actually add the JavaScript that's going to change that value between true and false when that drop-down menu is opened and closed. So that's just a way that it communicates its current state. And you have to be the one to actually toggle that between true and false as needed as users start interacting with the page. All right, and then finally we have properties, which provide some additional description of elements and or tell us the relationships between different elements that are on the page. So first up, we have ARIA label. And I want to talk about that a little bit more later, because sometimes when we're first learning about ARIA, we learn about ARIA label and we think, what a great little thing. Let me use it everywhere. And ARIA label should really be a last resort when no other method of giving something an accessible name is available to us. So it should be used sparingly and only when there's no other option. We also have ARIA labeled by, which basically just points to another element on the page and says, hey, that thing over there, it's my label, right? So that if I have a heading that's above something else, like it could say, hey, that's my label. That describes what I am, what I do. And then in a related one, we have ARIA described by, which is not a label, but it's additional information. So if you think about like a form field where you might have a label up top that says email address, and then you might have some instructions underneath that say, this is the email address that we're going to send your calendar invite to, right? So that users know, hey, maybe I don't want to use, little mouse 32 on this one. Like maybe I want to pick a more professional email address for this particular case because I see it's going to be used for this calendar event. So those places where you just have some additional information about an element, that's what we use ARIA described by for. And then we have ARIA required. So if we're making something that's standing in as a form field and it is required, we will use ARIA required. So if we're using a semantic HTML element, like an input type text, we have a required attribute that we can add on that element to mark it as required. When we're creating a custom component, that attribute doesn't work. So we want to use ARIA required. That marks custom components as required. And then we have ARIA live, which can be set to polite or assertive, which announces those dynamic content changes that we talked about when you have alerts, when you have some kind of a status message, when you have, an urgent error message that pops up, any of those things you would use ARIA live. And then we also have ARIA controls. So if I have a button that acts as a toggle for a panel of content, and I click it and it opens, I click it again and it closes, I want to programmatically specify that those two things have a relationship with one another. And so on the button, I would say ARIA controls and put the ID of the information panel that toggles, so that now there's that relationship is in the code. Now it's at the code level and I can understand like, oh, this button is related to this panel because it controls whether or not it's open or closed. So we'll use the ARIA controls for that. All right, so time to go to some live demos, which I think is way more exciting than slides. So let's go out of here and let's take a look over here at gov.uk, which is a pretty nice accessible website that generally does accessibility correctly. So we're going to take a look at how those landmark elements that we talked about are in use here on this website. And I'm going to do that by opening up VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on Chrome. Welcome to gov.uk Google Chrome. Natalie, aardvarkaccessibility.com. Window. ARIA Deep Dive. Google Slides, tab, group. You are currently on a tab, group.
All right, we don't need to have all that read out for us. So if you want to dive into doing testing with screen readers, the first command you need to learn is how to make it stop talking. So with VoiceOver, I'm on a Mac, so I've got VoiceOver. It's just hitting the Control key on the keyboard. So I'm going to try my best to not talk over the screen reader, and also to not have the screen reader talk over me. And I think the mic should be picking it up, but please do comment and let me know if you can't hear the screen reader. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the VoiceOver keys plus the letter U to open the rotor. And that's going to give me some quick ways to navigate around the current page. So let me do that.
Headings menu. On item 2, nav.
Okay, and I stopped it from talking. So you can see that I can pull up a list of all of the headings on the page. So if I'm looking for something in particular, sometimes going through all the headings that are on a page is the easiest way to do that, so that I don't have to kind of try to skip around the document. So I can pull up all the headings. I'm going to go ahead and hit the right arrow key on my keyboard to go to the next panel in the rotor.
Form controls menu.
All right, and next we have form controls. So this is going to be a list of all of the form controls that happen to be on the page, and they're here by their accessible name. So you can see the first item, it says show navigation menu collapsed. Remember that ARIA expanded attribute? So that's in use there. It is currently collapsed, so ARIA expanded false, and we see it's a button, and it's part of a group because it's going to open a menu. So I can go through, I can see what all of the different form elements are here. This is not just form elements in the sense of like text inputs that you would type into, but it's also any buttons that are on the page, which is why you see something like the menu button there when that's not part of a form, but form controls includes buttons. Okay, I'm going to hit the right arrow key again to go to the next panel.
Landmarks menu. On item.
All right, and that's the one I was actually looking for, because this is what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about the landmarks and how they get used here. So our header, a header tag in HTML or a roll of banner. So remember, I talked about how they don't always match. So the header section has a roll of banner. So that would be our repeating content that's across to every page of the site. And then we'll go to the next one.
Navigation menu, navigation.
Okay, and that's our navigation. So if I'm trying to figure out, hey, what other pages are on this site? This would be a good one for me to come and look for. I'm going to look for the navigation so that I can figure out, hey, where else can I go? What other content is here? Let's go down to the next one.
Main.
Okay, I thought it might say something else. Main, the main content area of the page. Very straightforward. It is the main tag in HTML, and it is the main landmark. Sorry, I forgot to mention navigation. It is the nav tag in HTML. So nav automatically has a role of navigation, or I could give a div a role of navigation. And then main, it's role main, or the tag is main. And then we have search.
Search.
Very straightforward. So just a search form. I can give that search form a role of search so that if I'm looking around, I want to search, it's very easy for me to find that. I can go straight to the search landmark, and I know that there's going to be a way to search the site within that landmark.
Footer.
And then our footer down at the bottom of the page. So any repeating content that happens on every page of the site, I'm going to find down there in the footer. It's interesting that it calls that the footer landmark because its content info is the name of the role and footer is the tag. So just an interesting observation. So that's a demo of kind of landmarks set up on a page correctly. And ideally, every single little bit of content that you have on an HTML page would be inside one of those landmarks. So every little paragraph, image, link, everything would be part of the header, the navigation, a sidebar, a footer, a main area, a search. So would be inside one of those containers. All right, let's go out of here. I'm going to turn off voiceover.
No items in. Landmarks menu. No items in. Landmarks menu. Heading level 2. Voiceover off.
All right, there we go. All right. Second most important thing to learn is how to turn the screen reader back off. So make sure you know how to do that. I actually got myself in a situation on my phone earlier where I let it go to sleep with talk back on, and then I was having a terrible time figuring out how to wake it back up. Okay, so let's talk about tabs, because that's a very common element that we see across the web. And there's no native HTML semantic way of creating tabs. So this is the ARIA Authoring Practices Guide, which you'll hear accessibility people sometimes call just APG, the Authoring Practices Guide. And it will step you through several different patterns and what the correct ARIA markup is for them. That sounds like, oh, perfect. If I have to build tabs, I'll just come here and get the exact markup, which would be perfect. That would be ideal. But the correct markup isn't always supported in the way that you would expect by different screen readers. So you have to test really carefully, and you have to know something about your users and how they're using the content. So user testing is really important. Testing yourself with screen readers and assistive technology is really important to make sure that these actually work. And hopefully this situation will get better, and we'll be able to more reliably create different types of elements and understand exactly what the markup should look like. So the APG is generally a good starting point for identifying what it should look like, but we have to do lots of testing and make sure that it does actually work with all of this different devices and browsers and assistive technologies that our users might be using. Okay, so this is what tabs look like. I think we've probably all seen them many, many times across the web. And one nice thing that is here is it does let me know exactly what keyboard support I should have if I'm going to build out a tabs element. It will let me know everything that I should support. And I also have a list here of what all of my role properties, state, and tab index should be on everything. And we have some sample source code. So let's take a look at this right now. And I'm going to zoom in on that just a little bit, just to make sure it's big enough for everyone to see. All right. So the class of tabs, that's just for us for styling. The class doesn't have anything to do with ARIA or assistive technology. That's just for visual styling. And same goes for the ID, but I'm going to bet that we are using that ID to refer back to this header here. So let's take a look. All right, so div role equals tab list. So that's the role that I would want to use. And here we have ARIA labeled by. So I'm giving an accessible name to my tab list, and that's tab list 1. So that's why this H3 had an ID on it, because that's what I'm using as my label. And this is preferable. Having this visible text used instead of using an ARIA label is preferable, because now we have text that's visible for everybody, and it'll get translated and it'll be handled correctly for everybody. So it's a lot better. Again, the CSS class is something that we're just using for CSS. It doesn't have any impact on accessibility, unless, of course, we're using it to set white text on a pale gray background. Well, now we've introduced a color contrast issue, but as far as the actual functionality of the tabs are concerned, there's nothing that's being impacted there. And then you can see that we've got buttons now, button with a type of button. And you notice that we are using a button, like we are using a semantic HTML button here instead of just a div with a roll of button. So as much as possible when you are building out a custom component, if you have something that basically should do something when you click on it, try to make it a button if you can. Like if that's an available option for you, do that because you're going to save yourself a lot of JavaScript and a lot of testing and a lot of handling things. And we see that it gets a role of tab. And we can see ARIA selected equals true. So this will be the selected tab, the currently active tab. And we see that ARIA controls that we talked about earlier. So this controls tab panel 1. And then, so we've got this tab list that holds all of our tabs basically across the top of the container. It doesn't have to necessarily be across the top. That's a design decision. All right, so here's the next button, and we can see that it's marked up very similarly, but of course ARIA selected is false, and ARIA controls tab panel 2, and it has a tab index of -1. So we didn't have any kind of tab index up here on this one. This one gets a tab index of -1, which will make the keyboard skip it, but allows us to move focus to it with JavaScript if we need to. So the rest of these get marked up similarly, role tab, selected false. They control their associated panel, and they have a tab index of -1. So now we can get down to the tab panels. So again, you see that we're using a div because we're not going to try to override something that already has some kind of other semantic element or semantic role rather. And it has a role of tab panel, a tab index of 0 so that I can get to it with the keyboard. I can tab to it. And ARIA labeled by. So I'm going to use ARIA labeled by instead of ARIA label. And it's labeled by tab 1. And I don't immediately see where tab 1 is. Oh, it's the actual button, I think. So the actual button is tab 1. So Maria here would be our accessible name for tab panel 1. And then each tab panel you can see is marked up similarly. Again, the CSS class, that's just to help us style it and make it look correct. It has no impact on the accessibility. And that is what our tab panel should look like. And I can jump over to CodePen and take a look at that. It's pretty nice that they have this because now we can kind of see the markup, see the CSS, see the JavaScript that's here, which didn't get mentioned in that other article. But if I tab, now I'm in the set of tabs, and usually with keyboard accessibility, once you tab into a component, if you need to move around within that component, you don't hit tab again. You actually use your arrow keys. So I'm hitting right arrow, right arrow, right arrow. Right arrow moves me back to the beginning. So I can move through all of those. And then once I'm on a tab, if I hit the tab key again, which that's confusing, I have tabs and I'm hitting the tab key, but I'm going to hit tab on my keyboard. And you can see now focus moved to that tab panel that has the information. And let's take a look real quick. I'm going to shrink this down. And the JavaScript here that we need to take a look at. So let's see. All of this is just getting set up. And here's my event listener. So I need to listen for a key down event. I need to listen for a click event. And I have to make sure that using those arrow keys is going to move me between the different tabs. I have to make sure that when I select a tab that it's going to change that ARIA selected to true and change the other one to false and toggle the display of the associated panel. So we have a lot of functionality that we're handling in JavaScript that we have to write to be able to make sure that those tabs work. So I want to make you aware of that just putting all this markup in place and having all of the right ARIA roles there is just step 1 in the process. And now you have to add CSS to actually style it to look the way that you want. And you have to add JavaScript to actually make it function and make sure that you are changing those, ARIA expanded and ARIA selected and things like that, changing those attributes as needed to make sure that the current state is reflected. All right, I've got a couple of questions in the chat. So let me go back over here. So Ariel asked, isn't the banner unnecessary as a landmark here because the key element is the nav within the banner? I don't have strong feelings either way. It's pretty typical. So for most of the landmarks, like header, main, sidebar, and footer landmarks, they can't be nested inside one another. Nav is an exception. Nav can go in any of the others. And it's pretty typical that it's nested inside the header and sometimes also the footer, sometimes also the sidebar. So it's nested in there. I think it's a good idea to have a header just because people are going to expect it, even if all it contains is a nav. I don't think that actually hurts anything. All right. And then Theodora asked, is there a good resource that talks about assistive technology compatibility? There are, so Adrian Roselli's blog, he will do a lot of work where he'll go through like a tab pattern, for example, and test it in all the different browsers and assistive technologies and report, and often even includes little screen recordings of how it works. And there are some others as well, but I couldn't just give them to you off the top of my head. But there are some places that have good information, and there are even some resources that have reasonably well tested patterns that you could copy with a reasonable amount of confidence. But of course, you always want to test carefully before you put something in production. And then Derek asked a question about VoiceOver. I realized recently that I'm often using VoiceOver with Chrome, but I should probably be using Safari since they're made to work together. Yeah, I make that mistake all the time. I'm using Chrome right now and because that's my browser that I use. But yes, generally speaking, when you are using a screen reader, each screen reader pairs with a particular browser in the best possible way. So VoiceOver should technically always go with Safari. JAWS should always go with Edge. Firefox should always go with NVDA, and on mobile devices, we do have a choice of which browser we use on mobile devices. If you're using an iOS device, you should be testing VoiceOver on your iOS device with Safari. And then on a mobile browser, you'd want to use TalkBack with TalkBack with Chrome, the Chrome browser on there. That is ideal. Are there real users out in the real world like using Chrome with Safari or Chrome with VoiceOver? Absolutely. But the general recommendation is to try to use the one that's paired because it's going to work the best, and that's what users are most likely to be using. All right, and then another question, I add a label like site header on the header or site menu because sometimes there are more than one layer of nav. Have you found any situations where being verbose here is a bummer? So generally, I would say if you only have one type of each landmark on a page, you don't have to label it because users know what it is. If you've only got one header, you don't need to give it a name. It is very, very common for pages to have more than one nav. And in that case, you absolutely do want to make sure that any others that you use have names. You could leave the main one unlabeled, or you could give it a main navigation name. Either one would be fine. But if you have any others, footer navigation, breadcrumbs, etc., all of those should have a name that clearly explains what they are so that you can distinguish between them. But in a case where you only have one, you don't need to name it. Users will know that that's the main header of the site. All right. So we looked at tabs, which is pretty complicated. Let's take a look at a much simpler one now, which is just a simple disclosure, which is where I've got a button that's going to toggle something open or closed. So very simple and in use right in their own demo. So let's talk about that. So here we have, so we have a native solution for this, but of course we can also build it with ARIA, in which case we'd want to use ARIA controls and ARIA expanded. And we'd want to keep track of what's what. So let's open up that CodePen example. Oh, and it's the exact example that we were just looking at. So I click here. I can also do it with my keyboard. So if I press the space bar, you can see that that opens and closes. And I believe that this is not using the native element. Yeah. So we have a button here and we can see it says ARIA expanded true, ARIA controls, the ID long description, and here's my div with the class of ID long description. So this one is a very simple and straightforward example where we just have two elements. We have a button and we have a div. We're going to tie them together with ARIA controls, and we're going to use that ARIA expanded. Now, one thing I do want you to know is that the ARIA expanded is on the button. It is not on the thing that opens and closes. That's a mistake that gets made a lot. It should go on the button. So the button is the thing that will actually say ARIA expanded. And then we have our ARIA controls. And so all I need on the div that's showing and hiding is an ID. So let's take a look at our native element that we have that actually does this, which is a details and summary, which gets marked up like this. And you can see I can open and close it. I can work it with my keyboard. No JavaScript required. So that's how handy. We just put this markup like this. We don't have to worry about any ARIA attributes. We don't have to worry about saying if it's expanded or not. We don't have to add any JavaScript to make that work. And we can style it with CSS to look however we want it to look. So we get keyboard support for free, focus management for free, the correct accessibility tree with the expanded state and everything, open and close state, and no JavaScript, where if we want to do that otherwise, right, we have to make sure we have the ARIA expanded and ARIA controls there. And then we need a script, obviously, that actually shows and hides the panel and toggles that ARIA expanded attribute. So we have to change that every time we click. We have to toggle the hidden attribute on the panel, whether or not it's hidden. We have to have ARIA controls in place and make sure that our state stays in sync, because of course we don't want to get into a situation where the panel is open, but ARIA expanded says false. So we have to always make sure that those stay in sync and that we don't have a bug in there that maybe what will happen a lot of times is developers will forget about keyboards and they'll make it work with, it'll work fine with the mouse, but if you use the keyboard, it doesn't update ARIA expanded, and then ARIA expanded gets out of sync. It's a whole thing. So just be aware of that, and that's something that you have to keep track of. All right. And then if you are interested in finding all kinds of ARIA mistakes in the wild, I'm going to tell you, you don't have to look very hard. You can look at almost any site on the web and start digging into its ARIA, and you're probably going to find some problems. So you don't have to work very hard to find those, but let's go back over here and we're going to take a look at some common mistakes. And I did want to kind of show you this decision tree here first. All right, so our ARIA decision tree. So the first thing I want to ask is there a native HTML element that does what I need? And if the answer is yes, we're done. We're not going to use ARIA. We're just going to use that native HTML element. Okay, now, assuming we want tabs or something else where that's just not an option for us, does the element have a name or a label? If yes, is there visible text somewhere on the page that could serve as the label? If yes, then I want to use ARIA label to by, not ARIA label. Only when there's no other option will I use ARIA label. Does the element need a role? So basically, is the element interactive? Is the user going to interact with this in some kind of way? So if yes, then I'm going to make sure that I add any ARIA role, any states, any properties that are required to make that work, plus the keyboard behavior, plus any JavaScript that I need to actually make it work. And If no, if the user's not going to be interacting with this, then you probably don't need ARIA. You're probably just marking up some text content or something like that. All right, let's go ahead and look at some common ARIA mistakes. All right, so mistake number one, div with a role of button and no keyboard support happens so much, especially in modern JavaScript applications, single page applications, especially using React. And probably the other frameworks as well, to be fair. So it looks like a button. I can click it with my mouse. It acts like a button, but I cannot move focus to it with my keyboard. So if I try to tab, you can see I'm now here on this home. And mistake number two, I hit Shift Tab and I'm back in the browser Chrome. Like I cannot move my focus there. So I can't get there as a keyboard only user. A screen reader will still pick up that the button is there, and you can still interact with the button with a screen reader. You can't tab to it like you should be able to, but you can use the rotor. And other screen readers don't have what they call, like rotor is specific to VoiceOver, but they all have a similar tool that will let you navigate around by landmark or by element type. So that's nothing new. So please use a button tag. If you absolutely cannot use a button tag for whatever reason, please make sure that you are adding all of the JavaScript and the tab index attribute and everything that you need so that this can receive keyboard focus and react to key presses as well as to the mouse. Okay, mistake number two is using redundant ARIA roles. So I actually see this quite a lot. There was a period of time when HTML5 was new and things like the header element and the footer element were brand new, and not all browsers supported them. And so the recommendation at that time was that go ahead and use, a nav element, but you have to also give it a role of navigation because not all browsers are going to know about the nav element. Not all browsers are going to know about the role of navigation. So let's use them both together to make a really robust solution. That was required for a period of time. It is no longer. We can stop doing that now. And then I also do see a lot of teams who learn about ARIA, learn about accessibility, and the first thing they want to do is go through and just put a role on everything. Not necessary, because all of our semantic elements have roles already. We don't have to put a role of link on a link. We don't have to put a role of button on a button. It already has that role. So we don't have to go through and do that. In some screen readers, that doesn't make a difference. It's going to just gloss over the duplicate role. But in other browsers or other screen readers, it does actually cause double announcements, and it's super annoying. All right. Mistake number three, having icon-only buttons with no accessible name. Okay. Icon-only buttons are their own accessibility issue, and you should try to avoid them whenever you can, because the icons are never as universally understood as you think. And it's confusing for many different types of users to try to figure out which icon does what. And I'm sure that you have had that experience using someone's app. Like, what is this icon? Where is the icon that does what I'm looking for? So try to have visible text whenever possible. That's not an ARIA issue. That's just a separate accessibility issue. But if I do have icon-only buttons, I have to still make sure that those have accessible names. One of the easiest ways to do it is to put alt text on the icon if it's an image tag, but often they're not, right? Sometimes they're SVGs, in which case I can put a title. We can put a title tag in the SVG. It could be an SVG embedded as an image tag, in which case it could still have an alt attribute. If it's inserted with, something like font awesome, where it's just an I tag with some CSS classes on it, we have to find a way to get an accessible name in there. So ARIA label is an option there. What's also an option is doing screen reader only text. that's embedded in the button that's visually hidden, but is still available to screen readers. So that's another option that you have as well. But just ensure, if you absolutely positively have to use an icon-only button, make sure that it still has an accessible name. All right. Mistake number 4 is putting ARIA expanded, but then it doesn't ever actually update it. And so it always just says false. And what happens is the screen reader can't actually tell the difference between like when it's open or when it's closed, so that you just don't hear anything. So we need to make sure that if we are using those states, that we're updating them with JavaScript as the user interacts with the page. All right, and next one, ARIA label that contradicts the visible text. I see this all the time. And this button, if we inspect it, you can see that it has an ARIA label that says click here to learn more about enterprise pricing tier. But visually it says learn more. Don't do this. Don't try to add more information to buttons by putting it in an ARIA label. The ARIA label overrides the visible text. So it's not a combination, it's an override entirely. And then the other thing that we've made really difficult is for voice control users, which the text calls them out here. When they say click the learn more button, the browser says, what are you talking about? There's no button that says learn more. Because it's getting the accessible name from the ARIA label. So we've made that difficult. There is a way to work around it. Voice control users can switch to a number view where it will show a number on every button, and then they can say click button 95. But it's extra work, and they shouldn't really have to do that because our visible name should match the accessible name. All right, mistake number 6, using role menu. So role menu exists, and it is meant for doing application menus. So like hard-coded, like these menus up here in Chrome. It is not meant for doing navigation. So if you have a collection of links that just take people to different pages, views, components, whatever, of your application, that is not a menu. It is a navigation, and it should have a role of navigation and or, right, using the nav element. When we put role of menu, it actually introduces some unexpected behavior into screen readers because the way that you interact with an application menu is different from how you interact with a navigation on the web. And we want to avoid that. Like almost always, if you're working on a web application, what you have is actually navigation with links in it. And it's not a menu that's a collection of functionality that you're accessing in an app. So keep that in mind and check your own sites and apps for role menu because it gets used way more often than it should. And we saw in the web 1 million results, right? Like it's getting used way too much. We talked about this one in the rules of ARIA. So putting hidden true on a focusable element. So I tested this with VoiceOver, and VoiceOver actually can access the link just fine, even though it says ARIA hidden true. So it's got some handling built into it for those kind of developer mistakes, but not all screen readers do. So be aware of that. You could have a case where I can tab to that, but then there's just nothing. So it's just like a weird ghost element. Like I tabbed to something, I have absolutely no idea what it is. It doesn't have a name. It doesn't seem to actually exist. And then this is related to the one that we saw earlier where we're adding the ARIA label on a link with different text. So doing the same thing with a form field. So having a form field that's correctly marked up, right? If I click on full name, you can see that it's a label correctly associated with this form field. The form field receives focus when I click on it, which is a quick and easy way to tell. But then there's an ARIA label on the form field with something else in it, which is going to override that label and is not helpful. So again, we always need to make sure that the accessible name matches the visual name. Like the name of this field is full name, and it is not enter your name here. And sometimes that causes a lot of issues. And I think sometimes people think that the ARIA label gets read in addition to, but it actually overrides and creates a new accessible name for the element. All right. Custom dialogue. So if you didn't know, there is a dialogue element. There is a native dialogue element, which can be modal or not. So whichever kind of dialogue you happen to need, that is covered with semantic HTML, native HTML. If for whatever reason you can't use it, we do have an ARIA replacement, a rule of dialogue, but it all has to be used correctly. And we also have to make sure that we're handling focus the right way. So essentially when a dialogue opens, oh, did I not? Hold on. I meant to, there we go. There we go. I had a little problem on that site earlier. When a dialogue opens, focus should be moved into the dialogue and it should be trapped in the dialogue. If it's a modal dialogue, sorry. So this is a modal dialogue. I shouldn't be able to get to anything else on the page when it's open. I shouldn't be able to tab out of the dialogue. Focus should be moved in here. And then when it closes, focus should move back to the element that opened, that triggered the dialogue to open. Also hitting the escape key on the keyboard should close a dialogue. You can see I'm hitting escape. It doesn't do anything. So there's quite a lot of functionality with dialogues that often gets missed because developers just aren't aware, right? Like if you've never used the escape key to close a modal, you may not even know that that's something that users will expect to be able to do, but make sure that if you're building one, that you have that built in there. And again, use the native dialogue element and you get some of that for free. All right, and then here we have, this is one of our rules of ARIA, is applying a conflicting role, right? So we have a heading role applied to a button here. And VoiceOver gets pretty confused and recognizes it as both a heading and a button, but you can't actually click the button because it has a role of heading, but it says it's a button, but then you can't interact with it. So it's very confusing. So just don't do that. It causes really unpredictable behavior. And especially like, I don't know if anyone has tested, right? We're talking about probably millions of possible permutations when you talk about a native element and then what possible roles you could assign it. It's unpredictable. So don't do that. If for whatever reason you have to apply a role to an element, make sure that you're using a div or a span so that you're not overriding the native role that something has on it. All right. So those are 10 common ARIA mistakes. Don't make them. And if you have any further questions about anything that we went over today, you can leave a comment on whatever platform you happen to be watching on. I'll see it anyway, and I'll do my best to get back to you and answer you. I do these live streams every other Wednesday afternoon, my time. I'm in California, so 1 to 2 p.m. California time. And I'm going to dig a little further into ARIA for the next one. So the next topic will still be on ARIA, and we're going to be looking at it a little more in depth. So we went over roles and states and the properties for today. And we'll dig into some other aspect of ARIA for next time if you'd like to join me. Again, it will be on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you learned something. I hope you had a good time. It was at least a little bit entertaining, and I hope I'll see you next time. Thank you so much.